Thank you very much, Kevin. I've been actually quite surprised, taken by surprise when I was invited by Sister Mary Julian to present on this topic. My only encounter, to use the word, with the wisdom of Saint John Paul II was many years ago when I started in the University of Bucharest, where I did some systematic theology, speaking about pain. I began when the Pope issued his Encyclical Ut Unum Sint, which I worked on with my students then. So didn't know how to handle this task. Of course, honored to be the only alien here. Then I discovered, browsing quickly the Encyclical, Veritatis Splendor, that there's something that I can talk about, namely the impact of modern ideologies upon the mindset of the Church, the way, in this case, modern theologians may borrow from trends and ideas in our culture, and to give something of my own background in Orthodox Christianity. I looked at a document issued in 2016 by the first, I think, major significant gathering of the Orthodox Churches throughout the world, an encyclical that deals with similar concerns, I guess. Now, just quickly to show you what I want to do. I'll be talking just briefly about this context of modernity. I use there the catchphrase Brave New World. You recognize the title and the topic of Huxley's book in the 30s, if I remember correctly. And you can take this phrase, Brave New World, both in its narrow meaning as ascribed to it by Huxley, namely a society of the future, a utopia, in the bad sense of the word, a society where eugenics is the narrative, conditioning the human mind, conditioning behavior, and all that. There's a lot of bioethical consideration that can be associated with that kind of situation, that kind of society, and so on and so forth. But you can also associate the same phrase, and this is pretty much what I'll do today, with a broader meaning, a generalization, if you like. By the Brave New World, I mean modernity as such, and you can think of Descartes' famous dualism, mind-body, where you have a first major simplification of the human being. The human being is made of two irreconcilable things, items, the mind, the reason, the intelligence, and the body. If you looked at his discourse on the method, you know that the two items are governed by very different sets of laws, very different principles. Another thing that may be useful to think about Descartes' dualism is the fact that his kind of reason or way of reasoning is very autonomous in the wrong sense of the word, as we have heard from a few speakers yesterday. autonomy as in independence from God, independence from objective criteria, reinvention of one for the sake of reinventing one, and so on and so forth. Relativism, if you like, to put it briefly. You can go beyond Descartes to other attempts in modern times, in early modernity, with the Enlightenment, for instance, with that kind of application, anthropological application of the cosmology of the clockwork universe, where everything is a mechanism. The human being becomes a mechanism for the Enlightenment thinkers, you know. Then the famous theories that have been vehiculated in the 18th century, what defines being human? Is it my will? It's the will, you know, voluntarism. Is it my affectivity? Is it my capacity to reason? And we know how many unilateral definitions to the human phenomenon have been given at the time, before the 20th century. The human being was actually shattered to pieces. It seems that before phenomenology anyway, it has become very difficult for modern thinkers to make sense of what a human being may be. Anyway, I think this is a very important context, so I'll not delve for too long on this one. But it's important to understand why I have chosen to look at these two encyclicals, namely John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor and the Encyclical of the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church. They both address similar issues. The world we live in, trends in culture, the way these trends influence the way we think in the church, the way we live our everyday life as Christians, and so on and so forth. And try to finish with some conclusions and kind of assessment of my findings so far. Well, it's all really a draft, so you have to excuse me for the very provisional state of my reflection. Anyway, often and for a good reason, commentators have noted that whereas Western Christianity was quick to realize and consider the challenges posed by the modern brave new world, Eastern Christianity proved to be far slower in its reactions. There is no point in arguing otherwise. A series of factors conditioned and still do Orthodox Christianity's slowness to respond to contemporary challenges. For one, its eschatological and transcendent figure proved to be a double-edged sword. This figure kept it out of the maelstrom of any rushed desire to fit in the non-traditional narrative of our time, but at a cost. It lost track of time, so that the last major overhaul it has undertaken was with reference to 19th century nationalistic ideologies, which have become its narrative ever since. That's the major problem the Orthodox family experiences these days. And listening earlier to the idea that the Orthodox, the Easterners, have something to offer in terms of conciliarity to the West, to the Catholic world, makes me laugh. It's I laugh, but there are tears there because today Orthodoxy offers to the world the most despicable portrait of a church that is unable to maintain internal communion. Nationalism being the factor at play, the main factor. Another factor is, of course, its geographical position. Traditionally, the Orthodox Church being confined to lands where the brave new world itself has penetrated slower than in the West, making impossible an earlier encounter. No wonder, therefore, that against this backdrop, only more recently did Orthodox Christianity arrive at grasping some of the challenges of our time through the reflection of the Orthodox living in the West, particularly. In turn, the Roman Catholic Church was there from the outset, witnessing the emergence of modernity, getting quicker its historical bearings than Eastern Orthodoxy. It engaged a critical conversation with the brave new world from very early on. For instance, it held 2 major councils in modern era where it assessed the impact of modernity on Christian faith and life. John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor continues these conversations on ethical grounds, preceding by more than 2 decades the concerns recently expressed in the Encyclical of the first major gathering of the Orthodox Church in modern times, the 2016 Holy and Great Council in Crete. In my talk, I'll look at the ethical dimension of the 2 documents, pointing out how, despite the historical and cultural gulfs between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Churches, both encyclicals illustrate similar concerns about the moral dilemmas of our age. Now, turning to the papal encyclical, what I noticed is the fact that the Pope has outlined a series of issues that have, factors that have impacted the Catholic world, Catholic thinking, particularly moral thinking, and indirectly, I don't think his intention was to map the landscape outside the church, but indirectly he managed to do a pretty good portrait of what we understand by the brave new world. He noticed the fact that peculiar to modern ways of thinking is a binary kind of logic, a logic of oppositions, of dichotomies. Free thinking against God, freedom against truth, culture against faith, science against nature. All these are very well represented in the chapter, I think it's the 2nd chapter after the beautiful interpretation of the encounter between Christ and the rich young man. Another aspect that he has highlighted is the fact that freedom for this modern way of thinking is a source of values independent from human nature and the natural law. And the concept of natural law is very important in the encyclical. It has been already mentioned by a couple of speakers. Another aspect is the relativization and dissolution of the values. When the human mind in Cartesian terms becomes the source of all kind of reasoning and the values. And rightly so, the Pope pointed out the fact that the major problem with all these shifts in thinking, ideas, currents, trends, and so on and so forth, is actually one. It is the fact that this modern mind of ours, after Descartes, is self-referential, and because of denying God, because of denying objective values, because of denying the divine revelation, it ends up by denying itself. That's agnosticism and ultimately atheism. And the Pope, rightly so, points this out. I have a series of passages that I have selected. I did my best to look at the original too. By the way, there are a few mistranslations in the English official version. Some words are missing from time to time, so I tried to put there. Of course, we don't have time for all this. I just wanted to flex my muscles, show my Latin. But anyway, you see there, if we look only at the word, sorry for, I use Apple stuff and it's all scrambled, but you see there the phrases in Latin. They refer to the key concepts in the encyclical. And for instance, in chapter 35, speaking of mapping the problem, or the extent of the problem, there's dissentionem inter libertatem and legem, this schism, if you like, between freedom and law, very important. I think it's a central concept in the encyclical. Then the fact that people, through consensus, can establish or discern or determine what is actually good and evil, and everything becomes relative to the tastes and the convictions of an individual or a certain community. Yeah? And therefore, good and evil are no longer clear cut, so to speak. Yeah? De bono et malo decenendi, and so on and so forth. And the fact that our brave new world is good at creating values. Some of them, the Pope agrees, some of them are important, like human rights and that. But he points out the fact that behind all this creativity of ours remains the same issue which we have created, which is the fact that we are self-referential, which is interesting because from a certain viewpoint, you can take this self-referentiality as Augustinian, if you like, yeah, from St. Augustine. You remember his soliloquia, but his soliloquia, how do you would say that in English? Soliloquium, whatever, talking to oneself, yeah. But that talking to oneself is not self-referential because it refers to God. Yeah, well, that was one of his early writings, before his conversion. But still, it promised something, and you see that something in his confessions, where the soliloquium becomes a colloquium with God. Yeah? And so on and so forth, and the autonomy of morality and all that. So I promised I won't delve on this too much, but this is just a matter of pointing out the fact that in the encyclical we have a real and very useful map of the problem, if you like, an X-ray of modern thinking. Sorry for the scrambled slides. In chapter 46, which is quite long, and of course I won't be reading this entire thing, we have a number of issues that the Pope makes reference to. Biology, the naturalist kind of way of thinking, where everything is reducible to nature, or if you would like to bring in genetics, everything is about the genes, where there's no personal freedom, there's no real subjectivity. I'm the slave of my genetic makeup, and so on and so forth. You cannot ask me why I'm a murderer. I'm a murderer because I inherit the murderous gene or something like that. Why am I a drunkard? It's because of my genes. It's never me. It's my genes, and so on and so forth. But also he refers to behavioral stuff, how we are conditioned, and that, again, this is pretty much along the lines of the narrative of the Brave New World, that we are conditioned by trends and ideas to think in a certain way. Consumerism, for instance. Yeah? Consumerism isn't a strong occurrence in the encyclical, but you can see it creeping up from time to time in the assessment of the data. And he points out the fact that all this complex of scientism, naturalism, and all sorts of ideologies more or less related to intellectualism, the Enlightenment message, and so on and so forth, all these have not been without outcomes or without an echo in terms of the way theology is being made, or used to be. Hopefully his message was heard and some things happened in the meantime. And so on this note, I move to the next bit, what I think is, again, very significant in the encyclical. It's an articulation of the problem within. What is the impact of all those trends, ideas, and so on and so forth, particularly scientism, even sociology and psychoanalysis, what is their impact in terms of the ways in which moral theology is done, or used to be. And again, I have a selection of passages. Maybe I read this one. I think it's a very prophetic way of addressing things, and I'll mention immediately why I believe this and why I admire this approach. It's because I'm a member of a church that seems, at least in the last couple of centuries or so, seems to have become accustomed to hide its problems, to hide issues, whereas this encyclical is a prophetic voice which shows that, yes, well, we know where from these problems come from. Some of them come from the outside, from ways of thinking that are foreign to the gospel, foreign to the church. But what matters is the fact that we have agreed, we have acknowledged, and we have embraced those ways of thinking. Well, you'll never find this kind of recognition and acknowledgement in the current official, anyway, institutional Orthodox narrative. Anyway, this is what the Pope says, chapter 4, so quite early in the encyclical. A new situation has come about with the Christian community itself, which has experienced the spread of numerous doubts and objections of a human and psychological, social and cultural, religious, and even properly theological nature with regard to the Church's moral teachings. It is no longer a matter of limited and occasional dissent, so variety is okay, but not what happens, but of an overall and systematic calling into question of traditional moral doctrine on the basis of certain anthropological and ethical presuppositions. At the root of these presuppositions is the more or less obvious influence of currents of thought which end by detaching human freedom from its essential and constitutive relationship to truth. Thus, the traditional doctrine regarding the natural law and the universality of the permanent validity of its precepts is rejected. Certain of the Church's moral teachings are found simply unacceptable. And you know far better than I do what this means, what this entails. But for me, the fact that very early on in the encyclical, he addressed openly this matter is of great significance, and the fact that he referred so persistently to the natural law, again, is very significant for me. Why? Because, as Kevin pointed out earlier, thank you once again for reminding me what I usually do. I deal with science and religion. So I look at science and religion from the viewpoint of the early Christian centuries, patristic tradition. And that kind of interest made me very sensitive to this discourse. Why? I wondered why the Pope kept repeating natural law. Because we know about this Pope that he was a very biblically minded person. Yeah? Why all of a sudden you have all these references to natural law? And I think it was his way of saying, look, I'm not a scientist, so I won't be able to give you the whole scientific jargon and all that. I won't be able to argue scientifically about scientific matters, but I can point you to something that is ours, it's traditional, namely the concept of natural law, and it is from there that you, moral theologians, can surmise your answer well, vis-a-vis the new trends in modern thought, including those that are based on scientism. Yeah. At least that's how I picture the whole situation. And because time flies, let me go past this. So another issue that he has discovered is the division between ethics and salvation in moral thinking. And I move quickly to some of his solutions. First of all, as has been said here repeatedly and very well so, his answer refers first and foremost to a holistic anthropology where those binaries do not exist. Law versus freedom, or freedom versus law, and so on and so forth. You know, science versus nature, free thinking versus God. They do not exist. A holistic anthropology which integrates reason, freedom, human nature, natural law, and God against the backdrop of a theological anthropology informed by Scripture and spiritually motivated by the attainment of holiness. And the fact that yesterday holiness was at the forefront of the conversation is a very positive thing. I believe that that's the ultimate answer to everything, from the dilemmas of the outer world to the dilemmas of the church within. Another solution tightly connected with the previous one is, of course, the reference to God as a source of existence, truth, and the values. That's what apparently, again, my ignorance here, apparently happened in some sectors of the Catholic moral theology, a relativization of this theocentric, God-centered perspective. And of course, to the relativization of moral ideas and concepts and values, ultimately, I'm not afraid of using the word values. He proposed a perennial, theologically anchored set of values that should be fleshed out, not in words. That's something that was very well discussed yesterday, not in discourse, but by way of life, by a conversion. And actually he repeatedly used the word re-evangelization or new evangelism. And I think that's another key concept in the encyclical. Now, in order to free themselves from unwarranted external influences, moral theologians must define their terms clearer. And of course, there's no time for this, but the encyclical offers, for instance, in chapter 37, in chapter 45, very useful distinctions. What can be taken from the outside culture and what should be left out where it belongs. And this integration of perspectives, which he suggests by way of distinctions, fits the bill of traditional holistic theological anthropology of the Church. Again, chapter 48 gives a beautiful description of the human being as multi-layered, if you like, but also open to God, open to the context, living within this world, living within this culture. And that's another thing that I believe is very significant, at least from my viewpoint, or the viewpoint of my interests, because it's never a matter of we against the world. So he has articulated very well the fact that we are different, and therefore we have to maintain our identity, our values, but we do that in dialogue, in conversation with the world, creatively, as it were. It is against the backdrop of this integrative anthropology that moral theology should converse with trends and ideas in the outer culture. Sorry, I keep using outer culture. That's Greek cliche, theaten philosophia. It's the way of thinking, the philosophy that stays at the doors. It doesn't come in the church, or doesn't belong with the church, but you converse with what's in front of the doors of the church. Yeah, without abandoning its own specificity. What the Pope proposes, and chapter 53 is very important from this viewpoint, is on the one hand a distinction between who we are and what the world is, but also an integration. How can we meet the world? How can we converse with the world? What can we take from the world? And on this note, I reached the topic of new evangelism, and I think that's very important. What's this new evangelization? It's preaching a faith embodied in life. This is very important. I believe that his encyclical is not philosophical, not intellectual. His encyclical is very ecclesial and existential. It's like a realization of the fact that, okay, we have said so many things in 2,000 years, let's try to live by what we have said already. A way of embodying the gospel will be the best proof that we are who we are. It's not just saying it. This entails an integration of faith, freedom, nature, morality, and these would lead together, 5 minutes, to a renewal of the person, of the human society, the world, including the world of politics. And I was very glad to see there some coda, some corollary for a new way of thinking politically. And so on and so forth. Since I don't have too much time, you'll forgive me for this. Moving quite quickly to the 2016 Orthodox Synod, it has issued a number of documents, perhaps one that would be a match for the papal encyclical would be the document on the world and the church, but I thought of rather looking at the encyclical because it's an encyclical, something that is addressed to wider audiences. And the synodal encyclical refers to internal challenges, but only tacitly. You don't get that. As I said, the current narrative is that the Orthodox are fine, perfect, ideal, in the best or worst sense of the word, ideal. Everything is perfect, there's nothing to fix, we are fine, we are doing well. But you see, popping up from time to time in the narrative of the encyclical. The encyclical runs well, but from time to time you see like cut and paste stuff that doesn't belong. And it usually refers to canonical or the propensity for anachronism in most parts of Orthodoxy, unfortunately, post-1989, and isolationism. Since we are perfect, why would we need this world? And the encyclical does a lot in terms of pointing to external challenges. What are the problems that we've Orthodox face in this brave new world, and so on and so forth. And aptly so, the encyclical points out the widespread immorality, relativism in terms of moral criteria, secularism, economic and cultural globalization, bioethics, and this is something that most of these concerns are also shared by the papal encyclical, environment, and the refugee crisis, the recent refugee crisis. So it's a more recent thing. Of course, there will be differences between the synodal encyclical and the papal one. And in terms of solutions, this is where I think the Orthodox encyclical is far weaker than the papal encyclical. It keeps repeating Holy Fathers, the scriptures, we do the liturgy, we go to the Eucharist, and this is the solution. Yeah, sure, ultimately so. But how do you make that embodied in whatever, the concrete circumstances of our life? And I have plenty of passages to illustrate this. Some Greek there too, because this one too is badly translated in the English. Not that my English is better than theirs, but anyway, knowing some Greek, I could pinpoint a few issues. And one, or whatever, not an issue, but I just want to point out the fact that, like in Veritatis Splendor, where there's a lot of reference to freedom and a consistent definition of freedom in a variety of contexts, freedom is also very well represented in the Synodal Encyclical, including the fact that the Encyclical speaks of the freedom of the gospel. So a kind of Christian freedom, gospel-rooted freedom, which is, of course, not the liberties of the world. And I have to run. There's a lot about anachronism, and one of the things that the Encyclical does well is to point out the fact that being a traditional church, because the Orthodox Church is a traditional church, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to live in the past and just look at what the Holy Fathers have said in the 4th century, 5th century, or I don't know when, and just copy-paste those answers. We have to adopt their way of thinking, the mind of the Fathers, and Church Fathers, that is. Mothers are included in Church Fathers. Yeah? And replicate that kind of thinking in our circumstances today. So it's a very sort of traditional, creative way of thinking, so to speak. And therefore, we cannot live in isolation. But one of the things that is very interesting is the fact that the Synodal Encyclical speaks of re-evangelization in two ways. Of God's people, which has gone haywire because of the lack of catechism, which is rampant in the Orthodox churches throughout the spectrum, and irrespective of the continent where the Orthodox live, catechism is in a shambles. Yeah, and so there's a need of Christian education within a rigorous setting within the church, but also the evangelization of the secular world, which is something that reminds me once again of John Paul II, who has launched in the early 90s, if I remember correctly, something like a crusade for the re-evangelization of Europe. It was a way of saying, okay, so this is no longer Christendom, yeah? And we need to preach the gospel again. Yeah? So it's interesting and a serious, not what I do now, a serious comparison between these two texts can lead to some very interesting conclusions, which of course I am unable to reach at this stage because of everything being too fresh for me. Really, I haven't read this Orthodox Encyclical before yesterday, the day before yesterday. Yeah, should have done it earlier. Yeah. Well, thank you for the invitation. If it wasn't for Veritatis Splendor, I would have not read this one. And yeah, there's a lot about the moral crisis of marriage and family, the society, and so on and so forth. Of course, I don't have time for all these. And there's a lot about the impact of scientific anthropology, genetics, psychoanalysis, statistical whatever appraisal of the human phenomenon, like in sociology and so on and so forth. I don't have time for this, but I think this is a very good complement, taking cue from Veritatis Splendor's similar approach. And this is where I end with some kind of conclusions. There are some differences between the two texts. The papal encyclical is addressed to the bishops, the magisterium. I found that very interesting. Why the Pope did not speak to the entire church, why to the magisterium? And I think this is a way of saying that, well, maybe there are teachers of the church that don't teach what they should teach. And also that the teachers of the church should take care of how the teaching is being done in some milieus where the teaching isn't done the way it should be. So it's a wake-up call for the people in charge, the overseers. Yeah? Very interesting. Whereas the synodal encyclical of the Orthodox Church is addressed, well, I use the urbi et orbi, yeah? So to everyone. It's a message that is supposed to be assimilated by all Orthodox, including those that read the encyclical only yesterday. It denotes, well, the Orthodox sense of ecclesial co-responsibility, because in our tradition, we believe that the entire body of the church is supposed to guard the truth. So it's a sort of different approach to the magisterial one. Another difference would be the fact that the papal encyclical focuses on internal matters, although mapping very well the external landscape, but focuses on internal matters, and it does that in a prophetic way, as I said, whereas the synodal encyclical refers to external challenges. We are not touched, we are untouched, we are okay, we are fine, we are doing very well. Oh, sorry, I forgot to whatever. And there are similarities which are very interesting. The impact of various ideologies and the natural sciences upon trends in society and culture. So that's the widespread scientism of our society. That's something that both encyclicals agree on. The fact that there are ethical concerns about trends in contemporary culture, politics, society. Both encyclicals tick this box. They both offer solutions drawn from theological anthropology. They both agree that traditional moral criteria are important for humankind's well-being, not only for Christians, for the entire humanity. So, in other words, what we are supposed to market, ecclesially speaking, is the virtues, that can lead to the well-being of more than the Christians that practice those virtues traditionally or by habit. Both texts refer to the new evangelization or re-evangelization of the church and the world through living the faith, not just proclaiming the faith. And I would conclude by saying that, albeit entering the arena only recently in a decisive manner, of course, the Orthodox articulation of the challenges we face and of traditional solutions matches the papal message. This is a ground for deepening the cooperation between our churches. And that's where I finish.